Okay, welcome back. If I could get everyone to please hurry to your seats so we can try and keep this train running on time. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. So welcome back. Shaw Communications has generously sponsored our next panel. So to introduce them, and I did tell you that there was going to be a few lawyers at this thing. So I'd like to invite one of them to the stage, Shaw's VP of Government Relations. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a political juggernaut in his own right, my friend Chima Nkemderin.
Good morning, Mike. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Mike, for the kind introduction. It's really exciting to be here today. Shaw is so proud to support this important conference on our province's future, based here in the West. There are so many positive signs for Alberta. We're slated to lead economic growth. We're seeing announcements day after day about new companies moving here and new investments. You may have heard that there's a little merger going on, maybe with the Commissioner of Competition willing, between Shaw and Rogers Communication, and we're trying to create a new national telecommunications company that will serve Canadians from coast to coast to coast. And we've made important commitments to Western Canada, including $1 billion to connect underserved communities in rural communities, remote communities, and Indigenous communities. We'll also have committed to creating Think Lab, a new national technology center employing over 500 professionals right here in Calgary while maintaining Calgary as our Western headquarters. We are optimistic that through partnership and collaboration that we can connect every corner of this province so that everyone can participate in the digital revolution. Now, you're not here to hear me, you're here to hear our guest panelists. And so joining us to share their insights are two of Canada's most advanced political thought leaders, Brodie and Gerald. Between 2005 and 2008, Brodie was Chief of Staff to former Prime Minister Stephen Harper and previously served as the Executive Director of the Conservative Party of Canada. Is currently a fellow at the Centre of Strategic and Security Studies at the University of Calgary, where he teaches political science. And I remember meeting Ian, he probably doesn't remember this, but we used to meet years and years ago when we both had hair. Ian is a member of the advisory board of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and author of Friends of the Court and the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal recipient. Joining Ian on stage is fellow McGill alumni, Gerald Butts. Gerald is Vice Chairman and Senior Advisor at Erasia Group. He also managed to navigate Pearson Airport to get here successfully, which was a challenge. Gerald has also served notably as the Principal Secretary to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau from 2015 and 2019, and was instrumental in designing the strategies for the Liberal Party's 2015 and 2019 national election campaigns, as well as Prime Minister Trudeau's successful leadership campaign in 2013. And it's important that we have someone here to keep these gentlemen on track. And we have the host of CBC's Power and Politics, the Venerable Vassy Kapelos. Vassy is the Ottawa Bureau Chief and host of the West Block for Global, and Ottawa was formerly Ottawa Bureau Chief and host of the West Block at Global News before she joined the CBC. She's a highly decorated and award-winning journalist. I've heard she's got really, really good questions. And these gentlemen should be worried. Anyways, I want to thank all our guests for joining us today, and without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you. Hi. Can anybody hear me? Yes, we can. Okay, thanks, Chima. I'm really, really happy to be here today. Nobody has to be worried about anything, I promise. And I'm really glad to be back in Alberta. Thanks so much for having all of us. The idea, or my idea for this conversation is to, I hope, get some interesting insight into the way a Prime Minister's office works, what happens there, but also to sort of move the conversation into the current state of politics, the state of media in this country, people's trust or lack thereof in that, and then also some insights into what both of you gentlemen think about the current political environment. So what might happen when the next election is coming, that kind of thing. So lots of interesting stuff for us political junkies in the room. Let's start off on the subject of the Prime Minister's office. And if I could, Jerry, I'll start with you. If you could describe for everyone sitting here what it's like to work in the PMO in like one sentence, what would you say? It's a trick I use on my show a lot lately, just succinctly.
It's a daily effort to control chaos and stay focused on the big things you got there to do.
Ian?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can, there's two pressures, right? There's the pressure to fight today's fire, which could overwhelm you if you decided to pursue that, and then you'd accomplish nothing. Or to remember why you thought you were there in the first place, right, and to try and make sure that your Prime Minister's time in office is meaningful and has some kind of impact on the country. And you try to make sure there's other people to do the daily firefighting while you keep track of the big picture, but that's a constant fight.
Yeah, I think I'm sure there are staffers who will roll their eyes when they hear me say this, because they heard me say it so many times in the time I was in the PMO, but the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing.
How hard is that?
It's next to impossible on a daily basis. But doing it well separates the successful prime ministerships from the unsuccessful ones, in my view.
When you first entered politics, Ian, did you think you would be running a prime minister's office? Like, is that a job that was in your head somewhere?
Oh my goodness, no. I arrived in Ottawa in the spring of 2003, and at that point we were just trying to keep the Canadian Alliance from blowing itself to pieces. And I thought I'd go and I'd help make sure that the Canadian Alliance didn't blow itself to pieces. But, I mean, Harper, or whatever else you want to say, but it was a unifier of people. And so the Canadian Alliance was in better shape than I probably thought it was when I got to Ottawa in 2003. We did the merger, he did the merger a couple of months later, and then we were on after that. But when I first got there, no, I had low expectations of just making sure that we didn't destroy the party in the course of the first summer I was going to be in Ottawa.
How about you, Jerry?
Well, I mean, you may recall that the 2011 election didn't exactly leave people thinking that the Liberal Party was on the verge of forming a government, to say the least. So we were, during the leadership campaign, we were fighting to keep the party relevant and alive. And I certainly had no preconceived expectations. We had lots of hopes, but we certainly didn't foresee, until really the week before it happened, the certainty of a majority government. We kind of held the prospect of it in the back of our minds, and you certainly worked toward that and hoped for it. But I remember spending most of the campaign in 2015 telling people not to ever say that word.
Really?
Yeah.
And then when you knew that it was a week out, did you know you would be running the PMO? Did you know that you would be occupying that position? Was that your intent?
No, actually, I was serious. I was torn. I really wanted to go back to Toronto with my family, to be honest. But it was just the way things worked out during the transition that I had, and this is where Ian and I got to know each other, when he was running Mr. Harper's office and I was in senior staff in Mr. McGuinty's office. We spent a lot of time together and did some productive things together, I think. So I was one of the people around who'd had some experience, and it kind of fell to me.
Ian, what do you think people don't know about the PMO?
I think once you've been in office for more than a couple of weeks, every piece of information that you get in the Prime Minister's office is an interested piece of information, right? Nobody comes into the Prime Minister's office on an ordinary day and says, here's the whole situation that you need to know, here's the whole picture. And with the greatest respect to the lobbyists in the room and people representing companies and so on and so forth, of course they come to represent their company's interests or their community. You've got people here in municipal politics. They want to hear, here's the view from Airdrie, here's the view from wherever. And so trying to get the actual ground truth of a situation in a bigger picture than that becomes increasingly difficult the longer you're in office. And that's why I think, people say, oh, why did that person stick around so long, or why is the Prime Minister loyal to that person? More often than not, the Prime Minister is loyal to that person because they'll give them the honest to God's truth. Yeah. And the longer you're in office, the harder it is to find somebody who will do that, because the more you're surrounded by people who, to be blunt, are getting paid to tell you their version of the story. There's nothing wrong with that, but the challenge on the political side is to dig a little bit past that, because you can't get caught. If you allow yourself, you will get caught. The Ottawa bubble means you're stuck there with people who are being paid to tell you their version of the truth. And getting past the bubble doesn't mean there's anything wrong, particularly with Ottawa. It would be wherever the government was. Getting past the bubble means to try to get past all of the partial truths that people are trying to tell you to get to something in touch with something that's closer to the ground.
Yeah.
I see you nodding, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, look, the longer you're in those jobs, Vassy, the more people see you as those jobs and not as the person in it. And you have to respect that because they're really important jobs, right? That you occupy it for, sometimes it feels like a very long time, Ian, but for anybody, it's a relatively short period of time, and you have to take it seriously and know that when people are petitioning you for whatever reason, what they're really talking to is the office. They're not talking to you as a person. And you can lament that or bemoan it, but that's just the way it is.
I told Mr. Trudeau's chief of staff, I've only met her once, but I told her a story when I was in the office. Derek Burney called me one day. I went through the morning staff calls and the staff meetings and so forth. I come back and there's a bunch of messages on my desk, and the top one was from Derek Burney, who'd been in charge of Mr. Harper's transition team and had been chief of staff before. And I said, well, Derek's calling, I better call him back right away. I called Derek right back right away. I said, Derek, I saw you called, what's up? And he says, I just want you to know you've been chief of staff for 19 months today. I said, oh yeah, I hadn't really noted the anniversary or whatever. Yeah, sure, 19 months, that's great. And he said, I left after 19 months, click. So typically, Derek's messages were always blunt.
Yeah.
He wasn't going to waste any additional words, but it's like you're past your best before date, and or you're coming to your best before date. And I think there is, my advice to every chief of staff is to say, circle 24 months from now and
Really?
be sure you're gone by that date.
Yeah.
Really?
You
Why?
know, I have a funny Derek Burney story, and since we're in Alberta, this was in the middle of the NAFTA negotiations, and Prime Minister Mulroney had said something, he had misspoke in public in the middle of the NAFTA negotiations, and the next morning I come into my office and there's a note call Derek Burney. So I called Derek and he said, well, I just want to explain what it was that Mr. Mulroney wanted to say, and I said, wait a second, Derek. You mean to tell me these jobs are a life sentence?
Yes.
He said, I'm afraid to tell you they are a life sentence.
Yes. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about a criticism or a narrative that has emerged, interestingly, that kind of crosses party lines, right? And that is around a sort of this idea of a centralization of power, or the PMO wielding too much power, because both your governments have been on the receiving end of that narrative or that criticism. And I wonder if you think, Jerry, I'll start with you, A, that there's merit to it, or B, what you think of that narrative right now.
I think there's merit to it. I thought there was merit to it when it was leveled against Mr. Harper. I think there's merit to it when it was leveled against us when I was there, but I also think it's overblown. I think that there's a lot of confirmation bias built up in it. If people tell that story, it's something people, if the media tells that story or departing staffers or ministers tell that story, it's something that people already think is true. In my experience, in some of the biggest pieces of legislation we did, it was the ministers who decided the contours of, obviously we had campaign commitments around things like marijuana legalization and assisted dying and carbon pricing and all these things. But it really was in the hands of the ministers and the cabinet committees to define how those commitments got implemented. And I wouldn't tell tales at a school, but I would definitely say there were a bunch of things that I personally gave the contrary advice that didn't happen. But that's the way it should work. And I'm sure you would be
Ian, what do you think?
Well, I wrote a whole book about this, which you should buy at the Center of Government. It's available for $28.95 on Amazon. It was a bestseller a few years ago, and I made all my students buy it. There are some things in government that are in limited supply, and ultimately what's in limited supply the Prime Minister has to make the decision about. So you've got only a certain number of hours of time in the House of Commons for legislation. That means no matter how long the ministers worked on it and officials have worked on it, it's a fantastic piece of legislation, everybody buys in. Yeah. In the end, the Prime Minister has to make the decision about, we're coming down to the end of the session before June, we've got time for 3 bills, there's 12 bills on the order paper, here's the 9 that aren't going to go. And there's no way the Prime Minister can delegate that. I mean, you can get advice from people, there's people to help, but in the end, the PM has to say, sorry, I know you spent 24 months on these amendments to the Copyright Act or whatever it is.
No offense to the Copyright Act.
No offense to the Copyright Act, but we've got some tax stuff we got to do instead.
Yeah.
And similarly, I don't think this has been a concern over the past 2 years, but it will be a concern again at some point. there's also only so much money.
Yeah.
And in the end, you know, the budget stuff is about dividing up a fixed pie at a certain point. And, you know, there's always $20 billion more of budget, except for the last 2 years, $20 billion more of budget asked than there is money to pay for it.
Yeah.
And in the end, Finance Minister can help, Treasury Board can help, but in the end, the Prime Minister says, sorry, I know that this program you designed is very important, but we're doing this other thing.
Yeah.
I feel like you're talking about it, though, from sort of like the policy perspective,
Sure.
and that's very understandable. I think some of us see it from a communications perspective
Right.
too, and I wonder if you can both weigh in on that and the idea that, and I'm not certain it's 100% true either, but this idea that so much of what is conveyed to the public, every little bit
Well, look,
has to be approved.
When I was around, I mean, the big change since I was chief of staff is like there was really no Twitter, right? Like I remember when I first heard of
What a
Facebook.
wonderful world
I
that
was in
would
New York. And yeah, and so now there's 24 hours a day of everything is documented, and you cannot have ministers contradict themselves in public. You cannot have a minister contradict the prime minister about the situation in Ukraine. Are we going to send this, that, or the other weaponry in Ukraine? You can't have ministers saying different things in public. Now, we have to find ways to let people float trial balloons and so on and so forth, but when it comes to matters of life and death or high policy or whatever, ministers all have to be on the same page. And that does mean at a certain point, you're going to centralize to make sure that there's some uniformity there. There's trust on some issues that are merging. You let ministers go say, you know, some trial balloons and so on and so forth. Somebody who has a 5 o'clock TV show is going to get the minister on and parse out the differences.
Not
in what
mentioning any
this
names.
minister said. No, it's not. It's the other network. You know, it's going to try and nail the minister for some difference between what this minister said and that minister said. You can tolerate that up to a certain point, but at a certain point when, you know, the President of the United States calls, wants to know from the Prime Minister, what are you going to ship to Ukraine? The Prime Minister makes a decision. Everybody's got to be singing from the same hymn book on that, because we can't send a mixed message when it's that big a deal.
Yeah, and I'd just add to that, it gets back to the first thing I think we both said in different ways. It's time management, right? You have a precious amount of time to do the things you were sent there to do. Do you want to spend that time explaining how the minister misspoke to the Globe and Mail, right? You just, I understand why it's frustrating, especially for people in your profession, Vassy, but from my perspective, it's purely, A, I think it's overblown, and B, it's an efficiency thing. You don't have a lot of time.
Okay, I have one more question about the PMO, and then we'll move on to kind of the state of government and media right now, and that is there anything when you look back that you wish you did differently?
You've had more time to think about that.
Yeah, I've had more time to think about it. I wish I got out of Ottawa more often. There is the pressure, especially when the House of Commons is sitting in question periods at 2:15, to make sure that everything's going to be fine for the day, and you got to be there to make sure nothing goes wrong. And that's fine. But I think about the times that I got out of Ottawa, I got back to Calgary, I've spent a lot of my life here, back to Toronto, out to other parts of the country. I should have done more of that, and that was a mistake.
Jerry?
I wish, well, there are a lot of things actually, but some of them obvious, I'm sure, to people in the room. But I wish we had spent more time in the first transition and not rushed through it. We came in, and I remember getting a briefing from the then clerk, now clerk, Janice Charette, who's a wonderful, wonderful, talented, brilliant person, about all of the things we had to do over the next 6 weeks. We had to go to APEC, and we had to go to the G20 and the Paris Agreement negotiations. We're obviously in Paris. CHOGM, the Queen was going to be there, so we couldn't miss that.
Can't miss the Queen.
Can't miss the Queen.
No, that's the only reason people go to the Commonwealth Summit.
That's right. And we did all of this in the first 6 weeks after the government was sworn in, and we looked at the calendar and said that meant, holy smokes, we've only got two and a half weeks to do this transition. So I wish we'd said, you know what, nobody's going to remember what the Prime Minister toasted the Queen in Malta in the fall of 2015 and just took our time.
Gotcha. Okay. The reason I wanted to talk about the state of government and sort of and media and the level of faith of the public is because I think, you know, I don't know you both that well, but I think we all share in common that we probably entered our fields because we believe in what we do, totally. We like what we do, and we you know, certainly I read those numbers from Abacus most recently, but lots of other places have done it with like a bit of heartbreak, right? And I reflect a lot on my own role in that and what I can do. And I wondered from your perspective, when you read that, and it sort of, to a certain degree, crosses party lines, but polling shows, obviously, especially where the media is concerned, or certain institutions, the level of faith from more right-leaning parties and level of trust in those institutions is lower. I wonder what you think when you read that, and if it surprises you at all, or if it's, you know, in line with what you saw in the past number of years. Jerry, you go first.
Well, it kind of makes me pretty sad to look at it, Vassy, to be honest. I mean, I was a coal miner's kid from Cape Breton, and I got to do the things I got to do in life largely because we had public institutions that people cared about, successive generations of people cared about and invested in, and I could go to school in Glace Bay, Nova Scotia, and get a great education just like somebody who was growing up in Toronto. And I really, really worry about the erosion of faith in public institutions, and I wouldn't blame any one person, party, or the media for it, but it's slipping. And you see what's happening in the United States. I thought the last bastion of common agreement in the United States would be that the Supreme Court were above politics, and it clearly has become the locus of politics in the United States, and that stuff really concerns me. It really worries me, because Prime Minister said this when we launched the leadership campaign, Canada's the best country in the world. It didn't happen by accident, and it won't continue without effort. And I believe that fundamentally to be the case, and the responsibility of everybody in rooms like this, and it's why I love coming to these things, because I think we may have different political viewpoints, but we share a deep-founded and justifiable love for the country, and we all want to see it be better. So I think it's incumbent upon people like Ian and I, who've had unique experiences, to try and communicate them in a way that's going to help people in this room.
Ian?
I think I have two observations on this. One is more general, or one is more specific to my side of the political spectrum, and one I think is more general. Conservatives back in the 1950s and 1960s in the United States, and then maybe in the 1970s and 1980s in Canada a little bit later, had at one point sort of a plan for conservative cultural institutions, for conservative leadership inside mainstream cultural institutions, and that basically fell flat. So I think there's a view on the conservative side of the political spectrum that the cultural heights of Western society are close to conservatives. And I think there's a certain amount of truth to that. I work at the university, I won't say any more. They say the conservative meetings at the university take place in what used to be the telephone booth outside the faculty club. You know, some parts of the media, some parts of television, some parts of Netflix is fighting this right now, right? Yeah. And so there's a view that those are not our institutions, in part because at some point in the past we misfired in trying to make sure we were present there, and that's a constant fight. It expresses itself in views about the CBC and so on and so forth. I don't say it as a partisan comment, but that's a reflection of that, is that we can't trust some of these institutions because they're close to us, or we didn't succeed in projecting ourselves through them. That's a longer term issue. I would say the moment of hope was, 2 years ago, confidence, at least here in Canada, that governments were by and large handling the early stages of the coronavirus pandemic well, and that at a certain point that slipped. I mean, I have my own views about why that was the case, but I think that's worth going back and rethinking. I don't know anybody in the public health community who thinks that vilifying people because of their health choices is a good way of getting people to take vaccines or so forth, and yet political leaders across the spectrum decided to make that an issue, and I think that was a missed opportunity.
Do you think, I guess I wanted to be a bit optimistic insofar as, like I said, I often reflect on my own role, what I can do, how I can combat that or counter it or help people increase their faith and trust. Is it, from Jerry, from your perspective, like what things could government do? What things could politicians do if you were still giving advice to try and not just say, oh, well, that's the case, like, too bad,
Yeah, I think we haven't talked about social media and the role it plays and how it's embedded in the engine of social media to create ever more, to create communities with ever harder carapaces around them, right? And then they just fight all the time. And that's not definitely that is not a healthy development for any democratic country. But I think that the job of leadership in moments like this is to find the things that everybody aspires to and the positive outlook for the country that everybody can agree about. And I think too often, and I'm not being critical of God, I hated that when I would see people who used to do, I'm sure you had this experience, you'd see people who used to do these incredibly difficult jobs go on TV and tell you how bad you were at it, and how they would be doing it so differently if you just changed these one or two things. So I'm not going to do that. But I would make a general point about political leadership that it's really easy every day to jump in and fight, thinking that winning that day's battle is the war, but taking a step back from it and trying to use an old-fashioned political term, triangulate above it, is ultimately, in my view, the path to success. And every day it's a function of the job that someone wants to drag you into a fight with them. And 9 times out of 10, when you get dragged into that fight, you've already lost because their objective was to get you in it in the first place.
Yeah, this was a constant fight I had when I was in government with ministers often who said, they threw a punch, it's the wrong punch, we have to punch back. You know, we can't let that charge go unanswered. Like, actually, I'm not sure it's worth responding to that. So picking and choosing what you're going to respond to.
Yeah.
I think also in public life, it is very difficult to say, I screwed up, sorry about that.
I agree.
And I think across some media institutions, some government institutions, some political parties, some academic institutions and so forth, we're not quite in the habit of saying, yeah, we did screw that up, sorry. Because the sort of the coalition instinct, the team nature of politics, it's a team sport, right? The team nature of politics is the team is always right,
Yes.
and we have to be here for each other, which is true. If we don't hang together, we'll hang separately, true.
Cliche for a reason.
Yeah. But you can also say, yeah, we botched that.
Yeah.
And, you know, Twitter's going to condemn you for that. Oh, you hypocrite, this, that, and the other. Just forget it.
Yeah.
Turn it off.
Just leave Twitter. That's
Twitter's like the
solution.
water cooler, right? I mean, and especially during the pandemic when none of us had real water coolers to hang around, it was a good place to kind of...
A water cooler for the most mentally tortured people on the planet, though, Jerry. Jeez, yes, true.
I don't know the water cooler you're hanging out at.
That's the problem. Nobody's at the same water cooler on
That
Twitter.
is the
Right.
problem.
Right.
That is the problem.
Okay, I have about 25 minutes left, and I want to leave a few minutes, 10 or 15 minutes for audience questions, so everybody think of what you'd like to ask. But before I do that, I want to ask both of you about what's happening right now in
Right.
Canadian politics. And I want to start off with the agreement made between the NDP and the Liberals. Jerry, let me ask you both from a strategic point of view, what you think of that deal, and second part of the question, how long you think it'll last.
Referencing what I just said about not telling my former colleagues how to do their job, I can see why they did it. It's certainty, or at least it's a enhanced certainty over what they were dealing with every day. And I think part of the problem of the first minority period was inevitably this happens, that 9 out of 10 stories every day are, when is the election going to be, right? And if you can take that story, again, it gets to time management. If you take that story out of the pipeline and have people talk about other things, then you've already won. But you have to fill it with the things that you want to talk about. And I think that not just this government, but governments around the world have been surprised by, if they read Mark Carney's book, they wouldn't have been surprised by the inflationary environment that we're facing. And they're struggling to figure out how to deal with it. And you can see it in everybody's body language, whether it was, I just spent a lot of time with senior colleagues in Germany and France and Norway and the Netherlands. They're all having the same problem. And my view is when you really get into trouble, is when you go out and say something with a sense of certainty to someone like you on your show, and you're really not certain, and it proves to be incorrect in very short order, and then you gradually get into a vicious cycle where you lose credibility every time you open your mouth, right? And you don't want to be in that spot. So I used to have this saying when I was running the policy shop in Dalton McGuinty's office when opposition to the policy advisors, that if you're not 100% certain of something, you're wrong. Because if something comes out of the candidate's mouth that proves to be wrong, i.e. the direction of the Niagara River, for instance.
Right. Mark's here somewhere.
Yeah, Mark Cameron is here somewhere, friend of both of ours. Then he's going to or she's going to lose credibility, and you can't put them in that position. So I would advise all political leaders in this really uncertain environment to not be afraid to listen a lot more than they talk.
And you didn't answer the second part of the question.
How long
I'm
do
kidding. How long do you think?
I don't know, Vassy. I mean, I think that it's an agreement that is wholly, the execution of which is wholly dependent on the continued adherence to the agreement of the parties. There's nothing, like Jag Singh can't go to the speaker and say, well, the Liberals didn't live up to this part of the agreement or vice versa. So it's going to last as long as the parties want it to last.
Ian?
The risk of the agreement is all on the NDP side, it strikes me. The Liberals, I think, could have governed on for quite some time with the assured support of the NDP because they're not in a position to go back to an election campaign. So the risk here is on the NDP side, and I think history shows that in these sorts of agreements across Canada and other similar countries, the risk is always on the junior partner having to defend what somebody else's decision has been. And so, Singh, who I think has done a bad hand of playing his leadership of the NDP since he became leader, since he became leader, it's been nothing but downhill for the NDP, is now gambling a big gamble that has enormous risks for his party. But if his party blows up, it's to the advantage of the governing party right now. So, I think strong position for the Liberals to continue on here. I don't see any particular reason why this would come out early, but I remember also the summer of 2005 when Mr. Harper went around and people asked him about what are you going to do about the sponsorship scandal. He said, it's not up to me, my position's on the table here. Go ask Jack Layton when he's going to break with Mr. Martin. And eventually Jack broke. So at some point, if there comes a point like that, in this case, I think it'll be in cost of living. Complain about the cost of living. Well, what are you going to do? Go talk to Jagmeet Singh about when he's going to bring the government down and get something moving on cost of living.
Kind of jumping off that and asking you to look into your ever-present crystal balls once again. What do you think, and I mean, I know this is contingent on when it happens, but if you were to kind of make the assessment now, what does your gut tell you, and Jerry, I'll start with you, about what the next election will be about? And who do you think the leaders of the Conservatives and the Liberals will be?
Oh my God, Vassy. Look at the time.
No, 21 minutes left. Yeah.
I'm going to politely decline to answer that second part of that question. I think it feels to me like the next election in one way, shape, or form is going to be a change election. And I don't just mean that in the partisan sense, I mean that in the sense that the whole issue set is probably going to change. And that makes sense because we're going through this incredibly disruptive period. It's, what's the old the cliche that the same character for crisis is opportunity in Mandarin or something like that. I mean, that's kind of the period we're living through. How many people in this room have ever felt this kind of disruption, right? I talk to a lot of our clients around the world, and I explain to them, I have to go back to my university days. In 1990, I was taking a full year course called Government and Politics of the Soviet Union, which started as a political science course and ended as a history course because the Soviet Union broke up that Christmas. And I think that's the magnitude of the crisis we're facing right now. It's both geopolitical, it has an enormous energy dimension, as people in this room know well. It's got demographics attached to it. When I was born 100 years ago, actually 50 years ago, there were 3.5 billion people on Earth. My kid, I have 2 teenagers, their generation, Gen Z, 3.8 billion people were born, and 90% of them are in emerging markets. Like, these are huge changes in the world, so it's gonna wash on our shores, however protected we feel ourselves to be here in Canada. Long-winded, sorry.
No,
it's a good way of avoiding your first
I appreciate that, yeah. But at least you said you declined to answer it. My guess is you're going to decline to answer too.
Well, I have a position overseeing the Conservative leadership race, so I got to be careful what I say about handicapping that race. I can't be drawn into that.
Do you want to take a guess about whether Justin Trudeau's the leader of the Liberals?
I assume he will. I can't see any reason why he'd leave. I can't see any forcing function that would force him to leave, and I can't see why he himself would want to leave. So I assume he'll run again. on a personal note, let me just say, I think the announcement was made public this week. My union just settled with my employer on a 3-year deal, which is 0, 0, and 0 for 3 years. If this governing coalition arrangement or whatever agreement lasts for 3 years, I'm expecting to be 24% poorer. I'm expecting 8% inflation a year for the next 3 years. I mean, it might be off by a little bit. I don't see anything that's going to disrupt that. And so I don't think cost of living pressure, I think all the cost of living pressures that Lisa talked about earlier and Monty talked about and so on and so forth, that we're going to talk about later on in the day, I think they only get worse. Yeah. And so I'm expecting to be literally 1 quarter poorer come the next election than I am today, just based on what's been agreed to. I don't think I'm the only person in that situation. Plus, I don't think the international situation clarifies itself or stabilizes itself anytime in the next 3 years. So all of those pressures continue to mount over the course of the 3 years or whatever's left, 2.5 years left in this deal. And that's the, Jerry politely calls it a changed election. I agree, that's the upside. On the other hand, the opposite side of a changed election is a very ugly political environment.
Yeah.
I have one last question before we turn it over to the audience, and that is, I mean, you have not been very partisan in this discussion, but especially take your, partisan hat aside for a moment. Jerry, if you were to identify what the Liberals' greatest vulnerability vis-a-vis the Conservatives is, what would you say? And I'll reverse that for you, Ian.
Well, I've said this publicly, I said it internally all the time, the Achilles heel of the Liberal Party is arrogance. And the longer you're in power, the more, the easier it is. I was interested to hear Ian say that what he'd change is he'd get out of Ottawa more, right? And I certainly agree with that, although I did get out of Ottawa a lot. Whether you're actually disconnected in the way you think, being disconnected in the way you sound, is the same thing for people. So I think that's the biggest danger, and it's a danger that every government faces that's been in power a long time, but it's in particular a danger for the Liberal Party of Canada.
Ian, what's the Conservatives' greatest vulnerability to the Liberals?
The vulnerability here I don't think is actually an external one. I mean, there are external vulnerabilities, of course. Achilles was vulnerable only at his heel. If only Conservatives only had 1 point of vulnerability, it'd be easier to run a Conservative campaign. I tell you that. That's my insight for the day. So I'm not going to go into all the vulnerabilities. I think the vulnerability for planning the next campaign is the 37% victory mindset.
Yeah.
I think all of the parties suffer from this to a certain extent, but Ford proved that that's not a self-imposed limit. I think it's possible because of the electoral system to win a majority with 37-38% support, and we've been seeing that regularly since 1993. I think a reach for a broader coalition than that is Conservatives have resisted that, and I think it's time to put that behind us.
Okay, great. Thank you for your answers. Let's turn it over to the audience. If you have a question, raise your hand, and someone with a microphone will come your way. We've got one question right there already.
Thought for a moment we'd settled everything.
No, not quite. There will be an election.
Barry Morsheed, I'm the leader of the Alberta Party here, and you guys talked about things you do better to make it better, but I really want to talk about your campaigns in the past and how they've actually set the stage for some of the lack of credibility and in the party system and the process, because they've been so negative in the last few times and so demonizing. I would like you to comment on how you end up at those strategies and why we can't have elections about ideas.
Well, the elections I was most closely involved in was 2006, and we'd picked, a short, but I thought forward-leaning platform, and we sort of topped it off with 5 key promises, 5 key priorities, of which I think, even though we had a minority, we delivered on 4 of them. And that was a deliberate choice at that time. Again, it was we had to make it a change election, so we had to make the case, not just that it was time for the end of the Martin government, but it was time for a change to us. And then, because of the minority situation, I think we all felt we were under great pressure to deliver on those 5 pieces. Again, we did the 4 of them in order to, solidify ourselves that we might be back into an election that fall, and we wanted to be able to say we didn't waste our time in office. That might be the last of those. I mean, Jerry's campaign in 2015, I think, had a different approach to the same challenge. Once you're in office, then it's difficult. You move more of turnout with a negative campaign to suppress your opponent's turnout than you can to encourage people to turn out for yourself. And because even your own partisans, to a certain extent, respond to the negative campaign on the other guy, you want to be fighting for your side, and that helps to mobilize your side out in a turnout election. Once we get into a situation where turnout, if we calculate it on the US model, in Canada is down around 50%, we're not really substantially better than most US presidential elections. That question of constructing the electorate, sorry, I'm getting into the weeds here, but constructing the electorate, meaning deciding who it is that you want to have turn out and who it is that you don't want to have turn out, becomes the overriding consideration as time goes on. And as the campaign electorate shrinks over time, that challenge of constructing the electorate, deciding who it is that you're speaking to and who it is that you want to have turn out, becomes a negative campaign issue. It's easier to drive people to the polls in fear of the other guy than in support of yourself. And I don't see I'd like to fix that, but I don't see a way around that.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Barry. I've been involved in 4 campaigns, 2 election campaigns where we won a majority government from opposition, and 2 re-election campaigns, one where we kept a majority government in Ontario and one where we were reduced to a minority in Ottawa. And I think I'd say a couple of things. One is it's really hard to win a majority government in Canada. It really is. And I think the period, especially when there's, my colleagues from the Crutchin era hate when I say this, but they won 3 straight majority governments against 2 Conservative parties, which had there been 2 Conservative parties in 2015, we would have won 200 seats. That's just the way it is. But I think the natural inclination when you're in government and you're fighting those battles we were talking about day after day is to stage the next re-election, the next election campaign, to have the final showdown on those battles, right? So that gets depicted, and it's of course the media's natural inclination to report fights, not peace. As Rick Brennan of the Toronto Star used to say to me all the time, Jerry, when are you people going to learn that plain lands is not a story? And I think that is true, and it's been true of all time and has been accelerated by social media. It gets back to the first point I think Ian and I were both saying, which is it's the responsibility of leaders in those moments to try and rise above those fights and paint a positive picture of where they want to take the country. At the same time, it's a dereliction of political duty if you don't describe for voters what you think the world will look like under your opponent's program. That's politics, right? It's not, as someone famously said, I can't remember who, it's don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And I think that it's just too tempting because it's easier to make a comparative judgment than an absolute one. And governments usually lose absolute judgment.
And the negative statements during a campaign are more credible anyway, right? Like, I could stand up here and give you 100 things that are great about Stephen Harper. You're going to discount all of them because I worked for him and he's a friend of mine and I supported the government. Fair enough. I mean, it's not that I'm lying. It's just that you're going to discount it. Whereas the negative comments during a campaign are always seen as more credible because in a certain sense they're more creative.
Yeah.
Anybody else have a question? I see another hand in the back there.
Hello, Ken McNeil again. I'm a portfolio manager, so I manage people's money. And as you were saying, the inflation over the next while is ripping into people's wealth. And this is likely a case where the politics over the last 20 years has continually bailed out and bailed out and bailed out and bailed out. And now it's very likely, to put a stop to this, it's going to be tough love. And I'm just wondering whether you think that the politicians could actually see that through, or is it another case of bailout and eventually we just lose control of inflation?
crisis management requires particularly nimble government, and that means a government where people trust each other and where people are working on a similar set of facts, and that's a difficult sort of thing to accomplish. It also helps if the crisis comes after the government's been in office for a few years, so you can build up that kind of confidence in who you can trust and who you cannot trust. Trying to impose actual costs on actual groups in society in an effort to return the federal budget to balance or to some sense of normalcy is extraordinarily difficult. And I think I've suggested in the past that Mr. Harper's push to balance the budget before the 2015 election might have been a year too aggressive. The fact that the Harper team at that point said that they were surprised by Mr. Trudeau's promise to run a deficit, I don't think that was particularly surprising. And so I thought that was an unfortunate loss of imagination on the part of the campaign team. I'm breaking Jerry's comment here about not criticizing your own folks. But I have to say,
They're not the campaign team.
The fact that Mr. Harper's one big election loss was at the end of a period of balancing the budget, as after the crisis was over, is a lesson that I think has been absorbed, learned, codified, acted upon. And so that's why I'm not sure that the inflationary pressures that we have today are a surprise.
Yeah, look, I think you've got the job of fighting inflation is rightly and properly in the hands of the central bankers around the world right now. And while the fiscal policy of government shouldn't make that job more difficult, the temptation is to do exactly that. So you're going to see a lot of tension between what should be the fiscal policy and the legitimate, the professors of University of Calgary with their pitchforks saying, I'm a quarter poorer than I was 3 years ago. What are you going to do about it for me, government?
Yes, what are you going to do about that?
I think that pressure, just to jump in really quickly, is very real, though. Like, I think that it's this really interesting position now where you hear the federal government and the Minister of Finance, the Deputy Prime Minister, sort of having to defend not doing more when they have, been, as our questioner asked, sort of characterized very differently in the past, at a time now when people really do feel like they could use a break.
Yeah.
The math of it is not easy to work out. And like you said, in your colleagues around the world, governments all around the world, including this one, are now faced with a problem that to a degree they contributed to, but mostly is external, driven by external factors. But they are very, like, the people of their countries are feeling it.
Oh, yeah.
And it's something we talk about on the show all the time. Like, it's the number one, I mean, we did a special on it last week, and I think we had like 2,000 people send in questions about how can this, this, that. It's like, it's very real in people's lives right now. So I feel like it's a unique political.
And it's especially true, like I grew up in a region, as it's usually described by the public service in Ottawa, a remote region of Canada.
Meaning not Ottawa.
Or possibly Toronto or Montreal. And you folks know this in this room as well as I do, that most things, like the federal government, and I certainly learned this going from senior staff in the Premier's office to the Prime Minister's office, that the provincial government's about things that people care about every day, right? It's about your electricity bill, it's about your school, it's about the hospital your mom is in or your dad is in or whomever is in. And the federal government is kind of a theological construct for people. But this thing, the cost of living crisis that people are going to endure because of inflation, is very, very real. So most federal politicians are not accustomed to dealing with that kind of tactile retail politics, and it's going to be really, really hard.
The last time, I shouldn't say the last time, when Mr. Chrétien and Mr. Martin's governments went through this in the mid-1990s, the public opinion landscape, the party landscape was totally different.
Yeah.
There were people in both major political parties who thought that balancing the budget and keeping taxes low was important. That part of the community was split between the two parties. So there was a constituency inside the Liberal Party, I'm not sure it was the majority, but there was you could carve out a piece of Liberal coalition that thought that balancing the budget and keeping taxes in line was important. That was a chunk of the party, because there was a chunk of the Conservative Party. Over the course of the past 20 years, though, since the Chrétien, Martin's success in balancing the budget, the parties have polarized on that. And every piece of public opinion polling I've seen shows that people who think that balancing the budget and keeping taxes low is important identify as conservatives. Like, we own that whole coalition. So, you know, and it's not as big a chunk of the population as it was 30 years ago. So I think the partisan dynamics of this has changed. Yeah. And so conservative governments tend to think that everybody believes that balancing the budget is important. That's not the case. That's a conservative view now. It wasn't for Mr. Chrétien and Mr. Martin, but it is now. And so, in a sense, when the business community and think tanks went out in the 1990s to propagate the idea that we had to kind of balance the budget, live within our means, fix fiscal problems, restructure the federal government, so on and so forth, there was a constituency in both parties that resonated with. I don't think that's the case anymore.
We have time for one. Oh, the alarm's going off. Somebody better wake up. We have time for one more question from the floor. I see a hand over there. That end of the room.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. Melanie Risden with the Western Standard. Just wanted to ask a couple of questions here. First of all, when we're talking about the erosion of faith in public institutions, and we sort of got into what can the government do, I'd like to hear from you both as to what you think the government has done wrong in creating or perpetuating that erosion of faith and trust in our public institutions and in the government.
I'll make a deal with you, Ian.
Yes.
I'll say the thing that I thought Harper did wrong the worst, and you can do the same thing for Trudeau.
Okay. No, I'm going to intervene. Reflect on yourself.
I am not going to do that. I'm just not going to do it. I'll be totally blunt with you. I'm not going to be that guy, ever. There will be no memoirs. But I will tell you, and it's maybe, Ian, you could do both if you're feeling so inclined. I think that Mr. Harper did an excellent job when he was in power of making his most radical critics look foolish by continuously investing his time and effort into public institutions. And I thought he perilously put that brand in jeopardy when he attacked the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I thought that was a huge, huge mistake. And people wrote it off, in particular, the populists in the Conservative Party wrote it off as an inside the Beltway story that nobody cared about. But I thought it was one of those things that he had forgotten what got him to where he was in the first place.
Well, there's a backstory. We'll have a conversation about that.
Goes back to
I wasn't there for that,
days
but I was
in
there for an
Alberta.
earlier round with the Chief Justice. Look, I hinted at it before, but maybe I'll put the dot on it for the Standard. I thought we had a moment where everybody was confident that the federal government was managing the pandemic properly, whether they agreed with individual measures or not, and there's all sorts of discussion about that, but that they thought that the government was doing what it could. I thought that the Prime Minister's comment that some Canadian citizens, a large number of Canadian citizens, had unacceptable views, that they therefore had to be organized out of politics with regulation of the internet and disinformation campaigns and so forth, that was bad. That was really bad. It may have been an adept partisan thing to do, but that has, I think, as long as he's around, he's going to have an eroded trust in government institutions as a result of that comment.
I will say, and I'll only say this because I've said it publicly already and during the election campaign, I was not a fan of having an election last summer. And I thought precisely because it would lead to moments like that. Yeah. And you can't ask people to make these extraordinary sacrifices in their personal lives for 2 years. And by extraordinary, I mean never before in any of our lives have we made the sacrifices we made. In particular, the voters who voted for the Liberal Party, like you know, the woman who's working at the Amazon fulfillment center in Brampton while we're all at home on our laptops. That was the real challenge. And I think that it was, you know, the government didn't have a great answer when you guys asked them on day one why we were having an election. And I think that led to a lot of the problems Ian just described.
Okay, we're actually out of time. Exactly on time. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your questions, and thank you very much to our panelists.
That was great. Thank you so much. You know what? I think Jerry and Ian need to do a buddy cop movie or something. Or at least, very least, go on a roadshow of some kind. But that was fantastic. And Vassy, thank you so much for making time to do this as well. Obviously a media superstar, and we're thankful. We are now at a 5-minute break. So this is shorter than the last break. So don't go too far from your tables. And up next, we'll be very excited to see Lisa Baton, the new president and CEO of CAP, for her very first public address as the new head of the Industry Association. So don't go too far. We'll be back in 5 minutes.